Ukraine for a political reason. What does that mean? Well, Congress passed the funds. Everybody agreed on it. And then what the GAO is saying is it was wrong for the White House to withhold that nearly $400 million package. Nancy Cordes has followed every step of this impeachment process and joins us now from Capitol Hill. Nancy, a lot of developments this morning.
That's right, and that's a pretty big bombshell on the eve of this trial, Nora, because it once again chips away at the White House argument that the president was justified and within his rights when he suddenly withheld hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military funding to Ukraine last summer. What the GAO, which, as you pointed out, is nonpartisan, is arguing is that the White House simply didn't have the right to withhold the money for that reason. And we know from reading emails from within the Office of Management and Budget at that time that there were a number of officials who were worried about that as well.
And Nancy, let's hold as we listen to the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell.
Against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The hour of 12 noon having arrived and a quorum being present, the Sergeant-at-Arms will present the managers on the part of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, I announce the presence of the managers on the part of the House of Representatives to conduct proceedings on behalf of the House concerning the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
Managers on the part of the House will be received and escorted to the well of the Senate. The Sergeant-at-Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The managers on the part of the House will now proceed.
Mr. President, the managers on the part of the House of Representatives are present and ready to present the articles of impeachment which have been preferred by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. The House adopted the following resolution, which, with the permission of the Senate, I will read. House Resolution 798, appointing and authorizing managers for the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States. Resolved that Mr. Schiff, Mr. Nadler, Ms. Lofgren, Mr. Jeffries, Ms. Demings, Mr. Crow, and Ms. Garcia of Texas are appointed managers to conduct the impeachment trial against Donald John Trump, President of the United States, that a message be sent to the Senate to inform the Senate of these appointments, and that the managers so appointed may, in connection with the preparation and conduct of the trial, exhibit articles of impeachment to the Senate and take all other actions necessary, which may include the following: employing legal, clerical, and other necessary assistance and incurring such other expenses as may be necessary to be paid from amounts available to the Committee on the Judiciary under applicable expense resolutions or from the applicable account of the House of Representatives. Number two, sending for persons and papers and filing with the Secretary of the Senate on the part of the House of Representatives any pleadings in conjunction with or subsequent to the exhibition of the articles of impeachment that the managers may consider necessary. With the permission of the Senate, I will now read the articles of impeachment, House Resolution 755. House Resolution 755, impeaching Donald John Trump, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. Resolved that Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors and that the following articles of impeachment be exhibited to the United States Senate. Articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives of the United States of America in the name of itself and of the people of the United States of America against Donald John Trump, President of the United States of America, in maintenance and support of its impeachment against him for high crimes and misdemeanors. Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his high office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his reelection, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In so doing, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. Number one, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A, political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia, alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. Number two, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, conditioned two official acts on the public announcement that he had requested. A, the release of $91 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Number three, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine, but has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Article 2, Obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the power of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committees undertaking the investigation served subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to exercise the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. Number one, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. Number two, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, the Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. Directing current and former, number three, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Preston Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of the impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Mr. President, that completes the exhibition of the articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. The managers request that the Senate take order for the trial. The managers now request leave to withdraw.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. The Senate will duly notify the House of Representatives when it is ready to proceed to trial.
And there you have Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, the Senate pro tem, letting the managers know that they will be notified when they are to return for the trial portion of this impeachment process. You can see it looks like just about every desk filled as each of the 100 United States senators listened to Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, read those two articles of impeachment against the president of the United States. They will return next Tuesday. They essentially will serve as prosecutors presenting the case against the President of the United States. They will get 24 hours to do so, and then the President's legal team will be granted 24 hours to present their case, and that will stretch over several days. It's not 24 hours continuously, it's 24 hours over several days, and just for your planning purposes, we're told that will begin around noon or 1 o'clock and stretch through the afternoon, so you can block out your time if you want to watch them with us here on CBS News. Want to bring in Nancy Cordes, who is on Capitol Hill. We've heard from the articles of impeachment before, but thus begins this process, this pretrial process.
That's right. And for the first time, you're really starting to see the first signs of what this trial is actually going to look like. Very solemn. All of the senators sitting at their assigned desks quietly, not able to speak to one another. They have to focus on the matter at hand. There has even been a station set up outside the Senate floor now where they can leave their electronic devices so that they don't bring them in with them and get distracted by them during the trial. Those House managers now have a very busy week ahead of them. They're going to be preparing their opening arguments, which, as you mentioned, will last for 24 hours, stretched out over several days, and they will begin to deliver those opening arguments most likely next Wednesday.
Thank you, Nancy. In the Constitution, Article 1, Section 3 lays out when the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. And so Chief Justice John Roberts is scheduled to walk across the street from the Supreme Court this afternoon, and at 2 o'clock, the Chief Justice will swear in the United States senators. And so for that, I want to bring in Jan Crawford, who is our chief legal correspondent. How does the Chief Justice see his role?
Well, I mean, it's a very different role than you would expect of, say, a judge in another regular trial. I mean, his role in this situation under long-established Senate rules is more ceremonial. You know, think about a regular trial with the judge totally in control of the courtroom, sitting up there on the bench, setting the rules, making rules of evidence. Here, the Senate has the first and the last word under those long-established rules. So John Roberts is not going to set the rules of this trial. The Chief Justice is entitled to make rulings in the trial, but guess what? The Senate can overrule him. So in some ways, he's kind of like a traffic cop. And his predecessor, the late Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who presided over President Clinton's impeachment trial, once kind of famously said that he did nothing, but he did nothing particularly well. Now, that's not to suggest that the Chief Justice will do nothing. I think John Roberts is a very different personality than his predecessor, William Rehnquist, and he cares very deeply about judicial independence and sending a message that courts are separate from politics. He's even tangled with the president. When President Trump has taken some shots at federal judges, John Roberts has jumped into their defense. So I would not expect John Roberts to be afraid of getting overturned by the Senate. If he thinks he's going to be needing to make a ruling, he's going to make the ruling that he thinks is right. I think he sees this as an opportunity to show the American people the face of the Supreme Court, and that the court, unlike kind of this partisan fray, he's in the belly of the beast. The Supreme Court is above politics. It's a real challenge for him, though.
Yeah, and earlier this week I spoke with 2 Republican senators who told me that as part of this process, after both sides present their case, there will be a vote about whether to call witnesses. There could be some Republicans who vote with the Democrats to call witnesses. We'll have to wait and see. And then also these senators get to submit questions, and that the Chief Justice will then essentially compile and read those to each side. So he will have a more formal verbal role at some point in the trial.
Right, and this, again, is kind of under like long kind of Senate guidelines. That's really nothing new. And what we've seen today and what we're going to see later today is kind of continuing with this pomp and circumstance, the formality of this pretrial proceedings. The Chief Justice will be whisked in a car from the Supreme Court over to the Senate. He may already be on his way, where he's going to be sworn in by Senator Grassley. He may or may not make a brief statement saying that he's there, you know, under conformity of the rules and the established in the Constitution, that he's presiding over the trial. Then he will swear in the senators. The clerk then will call the roll, the legislative clerk, and then the senators will put their names in the oath book. And that's basically it for today. Right. They'll go home for the weekend, the senators will, and then it will start in earnest on Tuesday with the Chief Justice there. But it's a challenge for him and an opportunity. Yeah, and we'll be back on the air covering that at 2 o'clock as well. I want to bring in Ben Tracy, who is at the White House. The president has in the past called this a hoax. What are you hearing from the White House this morning?
Well, while those impeachment articles were being officially delivered over there to the Senate, the White House press secretary did send out a tweet basically talking about the China trade deal that was signed here at the White House yesterday and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal that was just approved by the Senate a little while ago, and saying that while the president is working, the Democrats are whining. So that gives you some sense of the White House messaging on this. But we can tell you that behind the scenes, the president's defense team here at the White House is very hard at work preparing for this trial that is going to begin next Tuesday. And while the president continues to publicly kind of evolve towards this idea of wanting a quick dismissal of these articles of impeachment, they are not expecting that. They are preparing for a full-on trial, and they do believe that witnesses will eventually be called. They do acknowledge behind the scenes that there are enough Republican votes to go down the path of witnesses, so they are preparing not only to cross-examine those witnesses, but also developing the list of witnesses that the Republicans and the president may want to call as well.
All right, Ben, I also want to ask you about that breaking news this morning from the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, which said that the Trump administration violated the law in withholding that security assistant its aid to Ukraine. The Democrats calling that a bombshell this morning. I understand the GAO has responded.
Yeah, and just as that report was coming out this morning, Kellyanne Conway was here on the White House driveway, and we asked her about it. And at first she said she hadn't read it. I then read some of the passages to her, and the White House response is basically the aid eventually got to Ukraine, so there's no problem here. But the GAO is pushing back on this. They say in this report, faithful execution of the law does not permit the president to substitute his own policy priorities for those that Congress has enacted into law. In short, they're saying when Congress appropriates money, it's not the president's decision whether or not that money gets spent. So that's where they're pushing back. The White House behind the scenes is also pushing back, calling this overreach by the GAO. And one senior administration official is basically questioning the timing of this and saying that the GAO is inserting itself into what they're calling the impeachment narrative.
I do believe that that the GAO is asked to make a ruling on this particular matter, and that is why the GAO is ruling in and saying that the Trump administration broke the law on this particular matter. We are going to have much more coverage of this Senate trial of President Donald John Trump, as we've heard his middle name many times repeated in the last 2 days. We will return at 2 o'clock Eastern, 11 o'clock in the West, as John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States, is sworn in to preside over this trial and in turn swears in all 100 senators there in the United States Senate. Our coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com or on our CBS News app. There will be more on your local station and local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News, where we will have a full wrap-up. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell, CBS News, Washington.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.
All right, there you have it. We've been watching a CBS News special report on the impeachment of President Trump, and what we have just been witnessing are the impeachment managers walking the articles of impeachment over to the Senate floor. Then we heard Adam Schiff read them out. It took about 10-15 minutes or so, sort of outlining the case against the president. Now there's a bit of a break before Supreme Court Justice John Roberts arrives at the Senate floor. He is presiding over the impeachment trial, if you will, but not in the same way that he would, with a regular a court case, if you will, or what he does over at the Supreme Court. It's a little bit different. He's more hands-off in his role here at an impeachment trial. So we've got 7 impeachment managers, and they're now tasked with going back and building and presenting the case in front of the Senate. The Senate essentially serving as the jury for the president. Senators are expected to not talk to each other, sit through the 24 hours each of arguments on both sides, those arguing in favor of punishing the president for his behavior versus those defending the president. They're not allowed to bring their cell phones in, and specifically for some of the senators that are campaigning under the Democratic ticket to become the next president, they're not allowed to campaign either while they're sitting there. They can't skip this. You can't skip out on this. The 7 impeachment managers, Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, Zoe Lofgren, Hakeem Jeffries, Val Demings, Jason Crow, Sylvia Garcia, many of them with a background as attorneys. All right, so Chief Congressional Correspondent Nancy Cordes is standing by on Capitol Hill for us right now. So, Nancy, this unfolded the way we expected it to. That's not what happened yesterday. Yesterday, the impeachment managers walked the articles of impeachment to the Senate, but then they were not permitted to go inside. Much different now.
That's right, and you've now gotten your first glimpse at what this trial is going to look like optically. You have all the senators sitting there quietly at their desks listening as the House impeachment managers down in the well of the Senate. Today they were reading the articles of impeachment. In coming days they will be delivering their opening arguments and laying out all of the evidence against the president. But you start to get a feel for the solemnity of this event. The senators, as you mentioned, not allowed to talk to one another, not allowed to bring their electronic devices into the Senate. There's actually a stand that has been set up off the Senate floor for them to leave their phones and tablets and the like. So they are really going to have no choice but to focus on what they are hearing from the impeachment managers and from the president's counsel when they arrive as well.
So the next step in this process will be when Supreme Court Justice John Roberts arrives on the Senate floor. What will happen then? And let's talk a little bit about his role. I mean, there's a reason why you have a Supreme Court justice presiding over this process, but he's not he's not as active as he normally would be in his actual role on the Supreme Court.
Right. It's a really unusual hybrid of a judicial process and a political process because Roberts will be presiding. He'll be calling some balls and strikes. He'll be making some rulings, but he can be overruled by the senators themselves and a 51 senator vote. So he is not He is not in charge in the way that he normally would be in a traditional courtroom. He is going to be escorted onto the Senate floor in a couple of hours by a group of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, so a bipartisan show of support for him, and he will be sworn in by the President pro tem of the Senate. That's Chuck Grassley of Iowa, because he's the longest-serving Republican in the Senate, so that job falls to him. And then, once he's sworn in, Roberts will turn around and swear in all 100 senators to serve as the jury in this trial, and then they'll all come up one by one and sign a little book that says that they have been duly sworn in as the jury in this trial.
So, Nancy, you said that the Supreme Court justice can call balls and strikes, but can be overruled by the Senate. You know, this entire country is going to be watching these proceedings. Can he still have an impact, even though there's a likelihood that he could be or would be overruled?
He can, but it's a difficult role for him because on one hand, he is making calls for posterity. He wants to make sure that the law is followed. He wants to make sure that the tone remains respectful and the like. On the other hand, this is a political process. At the end of the day, he's not going to be deciding the president's fate. It's 100 senators who will decide the president's fate and whether he remains in office. So they have a great deal of control. And when they are off the Senate floor, they will be huddling. They will be talking. Their staffs will be talking about various witnesses that they'd like to hear from, feeling each other out, seeing which other senators are interested in hearing from those witnesses as well. As I said before, this is a very interesting hybrid, and there are sure to be moments of tension where Justice Roberts wants to do one thing and Senate Republicans who control the Senate have a different idea. Indeed.
And so as for the impeachment managers, what are they doing now over the next, I guess, until Tuesday?
Well, they are preparing a monster of an opening statement. You know, you typically think in a trial of an opening statement lasting a couple of hours. Well, in this case, opening arguments last 24 hours for each side, stretched out over several days. We're not talking about these managers and senators pulling an all-nighter. They are going to be on the Senate floor, however, for hours at a time, laying out all of the evidence that they've gathered against President Trump, and then the president's counsel will come and do the same thing in reverse, laying out their case that he did nothing wrong. And so what they're doing now over the next 6 days or so, these impeachment managers, is figuring out exactly what they want to say, what order they want to say it in, and who takes what. I would assume that Adam Schiff, who led the House Intelligence investigation, who sat in on every single one of those day-long depositions, who presided over days and days of open hearings with these witnesses, I would assume that he will do the bulk of that opening argument, but I think there will be a role to play for each of the 7 members on that team. And so, they're dividing it up. They're trying to figure out what makes the most sense. Just like any prosecutor trying to figure out how you collate all of this evidence in order to sway the jury, that's what they're doing here. Except in this case, they're not only trying to sway the senators, they're trying to sway the U.S. public, because if public opinion were to shift in favor of impeachment, that in turn could have an influence on these senators.
Yeah, speaking of the public, we know part of the debate has been whether or not witnesses and new documents should be permitted as part of this trial. And so there is, what's going to be happening in the Senate chamber, but then everything that's happening outside of that. And we're maybe even getting a little taste of what we can expect over the next couple of weeks, because we just received shortly before this a statement from the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And Nancy, I know you know all about this. They are a watchdog group, a congressional watchdog group, bipartisan, independent. Their conclusion was that the Trump administration's decision to withhold military aid from Ukraine was in fact illegal. You got to wonder about the timing, because it literally happened maybe a half hour, maybe an hour before the impeachment managers took their stroll across to the Senate. But can we talk about, what this means? This is not this is not an office that has much in the way of teeth there's no punishment that they can sort of dole out. But it's a very strong statement.
Right, and you can imagine how explosive this announcement was coming on the eve of the Senate trial. The Government Accountability Office is exactly what it sounds like. It is there to determine whether there is wrongdoing within the administration. And in this case, the GAO has said in pretty strong language, we're not used to seeing from the GAO, that there was wrongdoing here, and that in fact the Office of Management broke the law when it withheld hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine last summer at the president's urging. And so you have Democrats arguing that this is yet another example of the fact that the White House knowingly pressured Ukraine, withheld funds, despite the awareness that there was a legal problem with what the White House was doing. And frankly, you have a lot of Senate Republicans trying to avoid questions about the whole thing today. We have put a question about the GAO findings to a number of Senate Republicans, and they've sort of brushed us off with a variety of comments about not having seen the GAO report yet, and questioning the timing and all the rest. But clearly this is a wrinkle for Republicans, because one of the big White House defenses all along has been that the president had every right to do what he did. The president had every right to hold up those funds. And what the GAO is now saying is that no, that money was allocated by Congress and should have been dispersed.
Right. And I just want to sort of clarify, because I may have misspoken. The GAO is nonpartisan and independent. Nancy Cordes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We are going to pivot over to the White House, where White House correspondent Ben Tracy is standing by. And Ben, I am sure that the White House has been reacting to the GAO statement.
Yeah, so this came out this morning, and just as it came out, we were actually talking on the driveway here with one of the president's senior advisors, Kellyanne Conway. She said she had not read it yet. I read some of the passages to her, and the main response here at the White House is the aid eventually got to Ukraine, so no harm, no foul. On the record, the Office of Management and Budget, which is the executive branch office that officially withheld that money, they put out a statement saying that they disagree with the GAO's finding that that money was held up because they wanted to make sure that it was spent properly, that the taxpayers' money was spent properly in accordance with the president's priorities. The problem with that is what the GAO is saying is it's not up to the president to decide how that money is spent. That's Congress's job. That money was authorized, and therefore it had to be spent. So holding it up, that is the violation of the law. Now, behind the scenes, senior administration officials here are accusing the GAO of overreach. They're basically saying that they're inserting themselves into what they're calling the impeachment narrative at this pretty delicate moment of this whole process, just as this Senate trial is about to kick off.
Well, I was going to ask you, because this is sort of the second bombshell in sort of a day almost. Before that, yesterday, we heard from Lev Parnas, an associate of Rudy Giuliani. He has documents that he says proves that the president was very well aware of what he was doing in Ukraine, and that in fact it had nothing to do with corruption, but it had to do with the president's own personal needs and wants. Lev Parnas did an interview last night. He says he has documents that he finally got his hands on that were released by the courts. So it's a little bit of a 1-2 punch. I'm wondering if the White House is reacting to the curious timing of both of these things.
Certainly, and the White House is going to use that as part of its response to this and say that the timing of this is curious. But we should separate. These are two very different things. Lev Parnas has been trying to insert himself into this process for a while now, not having gotten a whole lot of traction. And the Democrats obviously were very happy to provide all that information from Lev Parnas, because it does raise a lot of questions about what was going on in the Ukraine. In terms of the GAO report, this isn't something the GAO just decided to do on its own. That's a request that comes from Congress. They then do a review, they write up a report, and then it's issued when the report is done. So that is more a function of timing, and that there was a request to do that. So I think the White House trying to say that there's some nefarious motive here from the GAO, that's probably more spin than it is fact. The Lev Parnas kind of media dance on television last night, that's a whole different ball ball of worms.
Right, exactly. So let me ask you now about the impeachment trial, right? We know that the impeachment managers will be busy building their argument and presentation. Who's defending the president? And do we have any idea what his defense will look like? Up until now, what we've heard a lot from Republicans, at least on Capitol Hill, is a criticism of the process as opposed to going after the facts.
Yeah, and I think you will see some of that from the president's team. The president's team will be led by Pat Cipollone, who is the White House counsel, and President Trump's personal attorney, Jay Sekulow. Some of their deputies will be involved as well. But those will be the two faces that folks at home will come to know. In terms of the defense, there's going to be kind of the talking point defense, which is these are the weakest articles of impeachment ever. This whole thing is a hoax. You should just dispense of it right away. They don't really expect to get a whole ton of traction with that. The real defense, especially when it comes to the charge of obstruction, is they are going to argue that the president was exercising his rightful constitutional rights as president of the United States to withhold documents from Congress and to block people from testifying. That's the executive privilege argument that we heard for many months now. If it feels like years, but many months now. So that is going to be part of their argument. And despite what the president has been tweeting publicly about a quick dismissal of these articles of impeachment, even this morning he was retweeting media allies who are calling for that. Nobody here at the White House behind the scenes expects that to happen. They just don't think that is politically possible for Republicans. And they are fully preparing for the fact that there will eventually be witnesses in this trial. They think the Republicans there's enough Republicans to side with the Democrats to call witnesses. So the White House defense team is preparing for that and also preparing for who are the witnesses they may want to call if the Democrats are going to get witnesses for their side.
We may hear from John Bolton after all. We will see.
You never know.
Ben, thank you.
You're welcome.
So we will have a lot more on this at the top of the hour. My colleague Tanya Rivera will be here. And of course, we will have live coverage as Chief Justice John Roberts and senators are sworn in at 2 p.m. Eastern. But for now, we're going to take a break. We will be right back. Vlad and I will get you caught up on some of the other stories we're following today. You've been streaming CBS and CBS News, always on. You can watch CBSN 24/7.
We've got an amazing story to share with you.
Let's talk about the latest developments. There's so many levels to this.
We have a CBS News exclusive.
Fires in California. What happens next and how does it all play out?
We are on a mission with NASA.
I understand you have some breaking news. It's not over yet is the bottom line.
This is a massive operation.
It's quite an adventure here at CBSN.
It's been a day.
You can watch CBSN 24/7. It's easy to find us and it's free. One way to watch us is on our website, cbsnews.com. Just go to live and then click CBSN. You'll be instantly connected to CBSN for all of the latest news. And you can also watch by downloading the free CBS News app. Just click on the player and you're watching CBSN live. Check us out on all of your devices. We're always on.
Our nation's capital. Decisions are made here that affect all of us. So join us every evening as we bring you CBS News original reporting from around the world while keeping our eye on what's going on right here in Washington.
A century after women secured their right to vote in the U.S., a long legal battle may be on the way over another constitutional amendment. Virginia just became the 38th state to pass the Equal Rights Amendment.
The